but it's a really, really catchy song. And we first heard it when we were at a Zach Brown Band concert, and he did like a cover of it. And it's like this really fun and upbeat song about this guy who's like dying of alcoholism but won't give up drinking. So it's like this very like what would be the SAT word for it? Juxtaposing tone versus subject matter. So it's really a catchy song.
SOP.
Yep. We'll play it. All right. Chapter 8.
Oh, you're recording.
I'll just edit it out. Chapter 8. Previously on The Great Gatsby. Tom. Gatsby, I don't like you. Gatsby. Daisy, tell her that you don't love him. Daisy, I don't know what to say. Gatsby. Tom, Daisy doesn't love you. Tom, let's go home. And Daisy, Gatsby, let's get out of here. Tom, who's that? Myrtle? Oh. Solid. That's really right. How do you like my summary?
That's a good
I think it's a good summary.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hey,
This is Kyle. Have you guys met?
No, I heard you.
You heard it on the
On the reading.
Yeah, you were very insightful.
Oh, thank you.
Thank
I
you.
thought you heard me like through the door right now.
No. You guys working on it again?
Chapter 8.
Oh, you're up to 8. I gotta get.
You're behind and you've not listened
No, I missed
to,
4, 5, 6, and 7.
well, 5 and 6 and 7 are not up yet, but 4 is up.
Yeah, I gotta listen to it. I go home. You wanna get together tomorrow?
Sure, that sounds good. Actually, Cat's not working tomorrow, so I'll let you know.
Yeah, give me a call.
So we'll see.
Is that your air conditioner?
No, that's the dryer.
Oh.
Graded 27 essays today.
Oh, where'd they come from?
They were turned in last week.
Oh. Gee, kids turning in work?
Mm-hmm.
What a deal.
Got like 4 kids in each class have not turned in the essay.
I know. I need the hair clippers.
Oh, yeah.
I was looking at your wild hair.
Yeah. What are you, a rock star or something? All the barbershops are closed.
Yeah, everything's closed. Gee. And we're supposed to now wear masks.
Yeah, I was hearing
Did
that.
they announce that?
Yeah.
That we're supposed to wear masks now?
In the Bay Area, anyway.
Technically, we are Bay Area.
Well, we're not part of the 6 counties,
That makes sense.
so we'll see.
Yeah.
And Chris is down at the food locker with her
With her mask.
mask on and her gloves on and long pants and a long shirt.
Good.
And she can go home. Yeah, give me a call tomorrow.
I will.
I'm around. I'm always around.
Hector, who we run with, his brother's girlfriend is in a medically induced coma because she has COVID-19, and his sister has been in the ICU for since Thursday, and she's
Same thing.
she's sedated with a ventilator right now because of COVID-19, which is crazy.
Yeah,
They're not in Bakersfield.
one of the Harrington girls, Jack and Maria.
Mm-hmm.
Her best friend, they're cops up in Santa Rosa.
Mm-hmm.
She died from the virus.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah,
This is crazy.
yeah. It's crazy.
I was saying to Hector yesterday when we were running, I was like, I've never heard of anyone dying from the flu. Really?
No.
So.
Really even getting really very sick.
Yeah.
But Colleen and Bill have a new one. They have the what's the name of the virus?
COVID-19?
Yeah, they have the COVID-20. It's right here. They've been sitting around the house eating.
Yeah, that's funny. Quarantine 20. The freshman 20, but
yeah, it's like the freshman 20.
that's fine. All right, we're gonna keep recording.
You guys keep
running.
running,
All right.
and I'll see you later.
All right, sounds good.
Well, Cat's online Pilates is good.
Oh yeah, you liked it?
Yeah,
I took it last night.
tired me out.
Mm-hmm.
I just can't do. If I could do things better, it'd be even more of a workout.
I know, and then I learned that. So after a while, as you get better, then it becomes more of a workout. Yeah. All right, I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.
All right, see ya.
See ya.
Nice meeting you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too.
Okay, let's edit that out.
5 minutes.
I couldn't sleep all night. A foghorn was groaning incessantly on the sound, and I tossed half sick between grotesque reality and savage, frightening dreams. Toward dawn, I heard a taxi go up Gatsby's Drive, and immediately I jumped out of bed and began to dress. I felt that I had something to tell him, something to warn him about, and morning would be too late. Crossing his lawn, I saw that his front door was still open, and he was leaning against a table in the hall, heavy with dejection or sleep. Nothing happened, he said wanly. He's disappointed that nothing happened, right?
Yeah.
He couldn't be the hero.
Just sat there.
He couldn't be the American hero.
Didn't work out in his dreams. Right?
Yep. I waited and because actually, if you think about it, that's what he was doing out there. He was dreaming of a situation where he got to save Daisy.
Mm-hmm. And this would all come to an end in the way that he wanted it.
Exactly.
He would take her away. And
Yep. Tom would beat her up. He would bust in the door by kicking it with the heel of his shoe, and then he would knock out Tom with, a bat because he's huge, and then whisk Daisy away. I waited, and about 4 o'clock she came to the window and stood there for a minute and then turned out the light. His house had never seemed so enormous to me as it did that night when we hunted through the great rooms for cigarettes. We pushed aside curtains that were like pavilions and felt over innumerable feet of dark wall for electric light switches. Once I tumbled with a sort of splash upon the keys of a ghostly piano. There was an inexplicable amount of dust everywhere, and the rooms were musty, as though they hadn't been aired for many days. I found the humidor?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like a humidifier?
No, it's like cigars. Keep cigars in a humidor.
Oh, so they don't dry out?
Mm-hmm.
All right. I found the humidor on an unfamiliar table with 2 stale, dry cigarettes inside, so it didn't work. Throwing open the French windows of the drawing room, we sat smoking out in the darkness.
So that I don't know if this matters.
Yeah.
So there's different types. There's some that they keep it humid.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, probably not. Then they didn't have the electrical ones or the rooms. But there's also these ones that are just kind of like canisters, and you put little packets in there.
I've seen those.
Yeah. So that's probably what it was. It just hasn't been used in a while. They didn't refresh it.
Yeah.
So that's why they're stale now.
But also they're stale because this is the end of the story, basically. Gatsby is stale. They're just used up. I mean, Nick's 30. He's about to die, basically.
Yeah.
He's an old man. You ought to go away, I said. It's pretty certain they'll trace your car. Go away now, old sport? Go to Atlantic City for a week or up to Montreal. He wouldn't consider it. He couldn't possibly leave Daisy until he knew what she was going to do. He was clutching at some last hope, and I couldn't bear to shake him free. And then finally, this is almost like this is Fitzgerald. I feel like previously Fitzgerald was kind of like criticizing society for making the dream impossible, for being structured in a way where you can't achieve the American dream. And then finally here, it's almost as if Fitzgerald is now pointing the finger at the dreamers, saying, "And now this is the part that's your fault, because you won't let it go. You are obsessed with a dream that you can't have, and that obsession is driving you crazy."
It's insanity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Keeps trying, even though they know they're going to fail.
Exactly. It was this night that he told me the strange story of his youth with Dan Cody. Told it to me because Jay Gatsby had broken up like glass against Tom's hard malice, and the long secret extravaganza was played out. I think that he would have acknowledged anything now, without reserve, but he wanted to talk about Daisy. She was the first nice girl he had ever known. In various unrevealed capacities, he had come in contact with such people, but always with indiscernible barbed wire between. He found her excitingly desirable. He went to her house, at first with other officers from Camp Taylor, then alone. It amazed him. He had never been in such a beautiful house before. But what gave it an air of breathless intensity was that Daisy lived there. It was as casual a thing to her as his tent out at camp was to him. There was a ripe mystery about it, a hint of bedroom upstairs, more beautiful and cool than other bedrooms, of gay and radiant activities taking place through its corridors, and of romance that were not musty and laid away already in lavender, but fresh and breathing and redolent of this year's shining motor cars and of dancers whose flowers were scarcely withered. It excited him, too, that many men had already loved Daisy. It increased her value in his eyes. Again, like just a very American and capitalistic way of describing someone that you are infatuated with, right? This is like infatuation versus love. It's the value that she brings him. He felt their presence all about the house, pervading the air with the shades and echoes of still vibrant emotions. But he knew that he was in Daisy's house by a colossal accident. However glorious might be his future as Jay Gatsby, he was at present a penniless young man without a past, and at any moment the invisible cloak of his uniform might slip from his shoulders. So he's like, he's not the real him, right? He's wearing a costume. So he made the most of his time. He took what he could get ravenously and unscrupulously. Eventually, he took Daisy one still October night, took her because he had no real right to touch her hand.
So he's saying that's why I used the word took, right?
Because he took her hand?
Well, because he took her versus like, hey, you want to come with me and talk?
Mm-hmm.
He didn't have, in his mind maybe, because again, they're using like the uniform as like, they're all equal. No one knows if they're rich or poor, especially like officers. In those days, officers were always rich, they were the more fortunate. So it is kind of like his thing, but in his mind, he doesn't have the right to talk to her. Like he knows he's out of place.
Mm-hmm. And the uniforms take away class, basically. They hide it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that, so this is the part, like he's beginning to like reshape the story of Gatsby, because it started off with like you feel you want Gatsby to win because you're like, oh, he has this guy, he built all this, he did it all for her, like how romantic, like girls are swooning, right? And then now it's like we're going back to like he did all this, it's like it's nothing, it's all nothing because he's doing it to be fake, to get to this thing that doesn't really exist. Like it shouldn't matter if he's broke or not, if he's a poor guy.
Exactly. And in this section so far, it's really shown that because the numerous times that he describes her house, right, as something that's external, something that's going to make him look good or feel good, as opposed to Daisy and her personality and the way that she makes him feel, right? None of that is in this part of the story. It's all about the externalities. So at the beginning, it is very romantic, right? Like the idea that he spent 5 years building this fortune and throwing these parties because of a woman that he loved. And then now in the story, we're seeing that the words that he uses are showing that it's not the woman that he loved necessarily. It was
maybe like the status he felt,
the status that she had that he wanted, right?
It's almost like Nick is realizing this and explaining it, right? Like,
yeah, because Gatsby might not be aware. He might think that he loves Daisy, but clearly he doesn't. He loves the idea of Daisy, not the reality of Daisy. He might have also, and then he describes her as like a thing that he takes, right? Like a lamp.
Like a lamp.
He might have despised himself, or he had certainly taken her under false pretenses. I don't mean that he had traded on his phantom millions, but he had deliberately given Daisy a sense of security. He let her believe that he was a person from much the same stratum as herself, that he was fully able to take care of her. That's what you were talking about a second ago, right? That officers would generally have been assumed to have money of a certain amount.
Yeah, and he didn't explain it. She just assumed it, and he let her believe it.
So their relationship kind of begins on a lie. As a matter of fact, he had no such facilities. He had no comfortable family standing behind him, and he was liable at the whim of an impersonal government to be blown anywhere about the world. So it's almost like Fitzgerald's like, the reality in America is that most people who have the American dream and who can't make it because it's impossible, they are like Gatsby. They are at the whim of like an impersonal government or society, and they have like no security in their lives. Anything could happen and just wipe them out. But he didn't despise himself. and it didn't turn out as he had imagined. He had intended probably to take what he could and go, but now he found that he had committed himself to the following of a grail. He knew that Daisy was extraordinary, but he didn't realize just how extraordinary a nice girl could be. She vanished into her rich house, into her rich, full life, leaving Gatsby nothing. He felt married to her, that was all. Interesting. Like he couldn't leave her behind in his mind.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we've got the language that describes her as like an object, right? A grail. He found himself committed to himself to follow this idea. And then where else? I think up above here, maybe. She vanished into these objects, rich house, rich life. So there's like an interesting like possessive nature to this language. When they met again 2 days later, it was Gatsby who was breathless, who was somehow betrayed. Her porch was bright with the bought luxury of starshine. The wicker of the settee? Who knows? Squeaked fashionably as she turned toward him, and he kissed her curious and lovely mouth. She had caught a cold, and it made her voice huskier and more charming than ever, and Gatsby was overwhelmingly aware of the youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves, of the freshness of many clothes and of Daisy, gleaming like silver, safe and proud above the hot struggles of the poor. So again, all this language of her like being compared to objects that are preserved and never age and never change. And remember, only things that aren't real don't age and change, right? So she's like not like a real whole person. Do you see it?
A long upholstered seat for more than one person. It's like a
love
seat, or
seat.
it looks like kind of like not a chaise lounge, but
kind of, yeah.
Fancy chair.
Yeah, it's almost like a fancy couch looks quite uncomfortable actually. But maybe one that you would lounge on as one individual.
Yeah.
Or like a Freudian couch, kind of.
Like.
Yeah, where like if you were a painting, you'd be fed grapes, right?
Yeah.
The painting of you'd be lounging there, someone's feeding you grapes, you have a glass of wine. You'd be in a robe. I can't describe to you how surprised I was to find out I loved her, old sport. I even hoped for a while that she'd throw me over, but she didn't. Because she was in love with me too. She thought I knew a lot because I knew different things from her. Well, there I was, way off my ambitions, getting deeper in love every minute, and all of a sudden I didn't care. What was the use of doing great things if I could have a better time telling her what I was going to do? Interesting. So again, we've got this idea that they are, he's in love with what she can bring him, and he's in love with something that's fake because he's not being honest with her.
Mm-hmm.
On the last afternoon before he went abroad, he sat with Daisy in his arms for a long, silent time. It was a cold fall day with fire in the room, and her cheeks flushed. Now and then she moved, and he changed his arm a little, and once he kissed her dark, shining hair. The afternoon had made them tranquil for a while, as if to give them a deep memory for the long parting the next day promised. They had never been closer in their month of love, nor communicated more profoundly one with another than when she brushed silent lips against his coat's shoulder, or when he touched the end of her fingers gently, as though she were asleep. You guys might be too young to know this, but this is a very accurate description of like kind of like the last time you're going to see someone that you have a deep romantic affection for. He did extraordinarily well in the war. He was a captain before he went to the front, and following the Argonne battles, he got his majority?
Yeah, majority. Like
Majority.
He's a major.
Right. His majority, and the command of the divisional machine guns. After the armistice, he tried frantically to get home, but some complication or misunderstanding sent him to Oxford instead. It's almost like Odysseus in the Odyssey. He just wants to get home, but these things keep coming up over and over again. He was worried now. There was a quality of nervous despair in Daisy's letter. She didn't see why he couldn't come. She was feeling the pressure of the world outside, and she wanted to see him and feel his presence beside her, and be reassured that she was doing the right thing after all. For Daisy was young, and her artificial world was redolent of orchids and pleasant, cheerful snobbery and orchestras which set the rhythm of the year. summing up the sadness and suggestiveness of life in new tunes. All night, the saxophones wailed the hopeless comment of the Beale Street Blues, while 100 pairs of golden and silver slippers shuffled the shining dust. At the gray tea hour, there were always rooms that throbbed incessantly with this low, sweet fever, while fresh faces drifted here and there like rose petals blown by sad horns around the floor.
So he really went to Oxford and left because of Daisy.
Yeah.
Because he wanted to go, yeah.
Quite possibly the most well-known university in the world at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, I have to go to Daisy. Also, though she doesn't understand, he's like, I'm at Oxford. I just can't leave. And she's like, but I'm sad.
Yeah.
Leave Oxford. Come to me.
Yeah.
Through this twilight universe, Daisy began to move again with the season. Suddenly she was again keeping 6 dates a day with 6 men and drowsing asleep at dawn with the beads and chiffon of an evening dress tangled among dying orchids on the floor beside her bed. So, side note for the young students, not weird that she would have like 12 dates going on. Like, this was kind of like common because dating was much more about you need to be married by like, I don't know, at the latest 22 at this point. And so you need to find a good match, and since people basically couldn't really have sex before marriage or really get to know their partner very much, it was kind of like, well, let's just give you like a lot of different options. That way, hopefully we can find one that kind of like works for you. It's like, that was not weird that she'd have like a bunch of dates. And all the time, something within her was crying for a decision. She wanted her life shaped now, immediately, and the decision must be made by some force of love or money, or unquestionable practicality. That was close at hand. Those are all very different things. Love is very different from money, and both of those are very different from unquestionable practicality, right? Unquestionable practicality is like the opposite of love.
Yeah, so I think basically she's getting married for the wrong reasons, right? It's like, I need to be married.
Exactly.
Yeah. I know people that have done that. Never works.
Never a good plan to feel like you need to be married.
Yeah.
Nope. Do you get a increase in your living wage, your like housing allowance in the Army if you get married?
You do, yeah, because now your family's bigger, so you need a bigger place, yeah.
Because I've heard of people in the Air Force getting married just because they would get like they were dating somebody and they're like, well, we might as well get married because then we'll get more money.
Yeah, a lot of people do that. Like, they want to live off base, so they're like, I don't want to live in the barracks, which is like the dorms, you know. They want their own place, and so they get married.
That's a terrible reason to get married. Don't get married for that reason. That force took shape in the middle of the spring with the arrival of Tom Buchanan. There was a wholesome bulkiness about his person and his position, and Daisy was flattered. Doubtless, there was a certain struggle and a certain relief. The letter reached Gatsby while he was still at Oxford. It was dawn now on Long Island, and we went about opening the rest of the windows downstairs, filling the house with gold turning light. The shadow of a tree fell abruptly across the dew, and ghostly birds began to sing among the blue leaves. Blue leaves. Like, leaves are never blue, right? There was a slow, pleasant movement in the air, scarcely a wind, promising a cool, lovely day. I also noticed, just think about it real quick up here, this, like, apart from, like, the metaphor of, like, the dying orchids, the description of Daisy up here is very much like that of a child, right? She's very impatient. She's like, I must like, do something now. Mm-hmm. And she doesn't have the ability to, like, just stop and think and wait.
Like, I'm supposed to be married.
Mm-hmm. And it's almost like she's following a script, right? She's not thinking about it. She's not following, there's no freedom in this, right? She's following the script of life. I don't think she ever loved him. Gatsby turned around from a window and looked at me challengingly. You must remember, old sport, she was very excited this afternoon. He told her those things in a way that frightened her, that made it look as if I was some kind of cheap sharper. And the result was she hardly knew what she was saying. So now Gatsby's like, what would be the term? He's like trying to like justify what happened in his mind. He sat down gloomily. Of course she might have loved him, but just for a minute, when they were first married, and loved me more even then. Do you see? Oh, Poor Gatsby.
Can't let go.
Can't let go. He's like conspiracy theory now. Suddenly, he came out with a curious remark. In any case, he said, it was just personal. What could you make of that, except to suspect some intensity in his conception of the affair that couldn't be measured? He came back from France when Tom and Daisy were still on their wedding trip and made a miserable but irresistible journey to Louisville on the last of his army pay. So he spent the last of his money on getting down to where Daisy was. He stayed there a week, walking the streets where their footsteps had clicked together through the November night and revisiting the out-of-the-way places to which they had driven in her white car. Just as Daisy's house had always seemed to him more mysterious and gay than other houses, so his idea of the city itself, even though she was gone from it, was pervaded with a melancholy beauty. So it's almost like Fitzgerald is like arguing that people do this too often, this idea of they get so focused on the past that they can't move on. Mm-hmm. And then what does Gatsby do with his money? He uses all of his money to try and recreate the past instead of trying to make something new.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all wasted.
Mm-hmm. He left feeling that if he had searched harder, he might have found her, that he was leaving her behind. The day coach, he was penniless now, was hot. He went out to the open vestibule and sat down on a folding chair, and the station slid away, and the backs of unfamiliar buildings moved by. Then, out into the Springfields, where a yellow trolley raced them for a minute with people in it who might once have seen the pale magic of her face along the casual street. So it's like Gatsby sees her everywhere. He's like, you might have rested your eyes upon the beautiful Daisy.
Everything reminds him of her.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, he's just so obsessed, right?
Mm-hmm. Obsessed, exactly, right? It's like the American dream is this lovely idea, but in reality, it's simply a fictional thing that reflects people's obsession with making a bunch of money, becoming rich. The track curved, and now it was going away from the sun, which, as it sank lower, seemed to spread itself in benediction over the vanishing city where she had drawn her breath. He stretched out his hand desperately, as if to snatch only a wisp of air, to save a fragment of the spot that she had made lovely for him. It's like Gatsby has played this over in his head so much that he's created this fictionalized romantic story, right? What are the odds that he literally lifted his hand to grab the mist or the air?
He's standing on his in his yard, reaching for the green light too.
Yeah.
When you think about that, that's so dumb. No one what is he really reaching for? Or is he just doing that to make the his own mind that makes it stronger?
Or is he doing it only when he thinks Nick is watching, so that he appears to be the romantic lover? Yeah, don't be like Gatsby. But it was all going by too fast now for his blurred eyes, and he knew that he had lost that part of it, the freshest and the best forever. It was 9 o'clock when we finished breakfast and went out on the porch. The night had made a sharp difference in the weather, and there was an autumn flavor in the air. The gardener, the last one of Gatsby's former servants, came to the foot of the steps. I'm going to drain the pool today, Mr. Gatsby. Leaves will start falling pretty soon, and then there's always trouble with the pipes. Don't do it today, Gatsby answered. He turned to me apologetically. You know, old sport, I'd never used the pool all summer. I looked at my watch and stood up. 12 minutes to my train. I didn't want to go to the city. I wasn't worth a decent stroke of work, but it was more than that. I didn't want to leave Gatsby. I missed that train, and then another, before I could get myself away. I'll call you up, I said finally. Do, old sport. I'll call you about noon. We walked slowly down the steps. I suppose Daisy will call, too. He looked at me anxiously, as if he hoped I'd corroborate this. I suppose so. Well, goodbye. We shook hands, and I started away. Just before I reached the hedge, I remembered something, and turned around. They're a rotten crowd, I shouted across the lawn. You're worth the whole damn bunch put together. I've always been glad I said that. It was the only compliment I ever gave him, because I disapproved of him from beginning to end. First, he nodded politely, and then his face broke into that radiant and understanding smile, as if we'd been in ecstatic cahoots on that fact all the time. His gorgeous pink rag of a suit made a bright spot of color against the white steps, and I thought of the night when I first came to his ancestral home 3 months before. The lawn and drive had been crowded with the faces of those who guessed at his corruption, and he had stood on those steps, concealing his incorruptible dream as he waved them goodbye. It's almost like Fitzgerald's with that line. It's almost like he's saying like kind of like admitting that we all have a tendency to like root for the overly romantic person, right? Like there's the player who has been in the G League with the NBA. Do you know what that is?
Yeah.
Remember the guy, and he played for the Lakers. He last year once in one game they like brought him up from the G League. Mm-hmm. So the G League is the Gatorade League for the NBA, and it's basically like they don't make any money. Like they make like $25,000 a year, which is great until you're like 17 or 18 years old, maybe 22, and then you're like, I need to have a real job. And so this guy's been playing for the G League since he was out of college, and I think he was in his late 30s. And then finally, he got brought up to the Lakers, and he played one game last year, and then they put him back down in the G League. And when that happened, like everyone was like talking about like how great it was that he made it, even just for one game to the Lakers. And like the whole time I was listening, I was like, it's true. I like feel really like happy for this person who I don't know at all. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I was like, but he's wasted so much time because he was like married, he has kids, and he can't really pay the bills with his job. Mm-hmm. And it's like, but we all have this tendency to do what Nick kind of said, right? And romanticize and root for the overly romantic person, the dreamer.
Yeah. And you want him to win. You
do want him to win.
It's like this guy went to college, so he could do more than just play basketball for $25,000 a year.
Yep.
Yep. Which I'm sure he has another job, but
it's also very American that we want him to win. We always want the dreamers to win.
To get what he wants, yeah.
Mm-hmm. The Germans would not want the dreamer to win. They'd be like, it's very, very illogical.
We'll choose the winners.
I thanked him for his hospitality. We were always thanking him for that, I and others. Goodbye, I called. I enjoyed breakfast, Gatsby. Up in the city, I tried for a while to list the quotations on an interminable amount of stock. Then I fell asleep in my swivel chair. Just before noon, the phone woke me, and I started up with sweat breaking out on my forehead. It was Jordan Baker. She often called me up at this hour because the uncertainty of her own movements between hotels and clubs and private houses made her hard to find in any other way. Usually her voice came over the wire as something fresh and cool, as if a divot? Yeah, a divot in golf. As if a divot from a green golf links had come sailing in at the office window. But this morning it seemed harsh and dry. I've left Daisy's house, she said. I'm at Hempstead, and I'm going down to Southampton this afternoon. Probably it had been tactful to leave Daisy's house, but the act annoyed me, and her next remark made me rigid. You weren't so nice to me last night. How could it have mattered then? Silence for a moment then. However, I want to see you. I want to see you too. Suppose I don't go to Southampton and come into town this afternoon. No, I don't think this afternoon. Very well. It's impossible this afternoon. We talked like that for a while, and then abruptly we weren't talking any longer. I don't know which of us hung up with a sharp click, but I know I didn't care. I couldn't have talked to her across a tea table that day if I never talked to her again in the world. I called Gatsby's house a few minutes later, but the line was busy. I tried 4 times. Finally, an exasperated central told me the wire was being kept open for long distance from Detroit. Taking out my timetable, I drew a small circle around the 3:15 train. Then I leaned back in my chair and tried to think. It was just noon. Again, though, we see Nick not working. Mm-hmm. When I passed the ash heap on the train that morning, I had crossed deliberately to the other side of the car. I supposed there'd be a curious crowd around there all day with little boys searching for dark spots in the dust and some garrulous man telling over and over what had happened until it became less and less real, even to him, and he could tell it no longer, and Myrtle Wilson's tragic achievement was forgotten. Now I want to go back a little and tell what happened at the garage after we left there the night before. They had difficulty in locating the sister, Catherine. She must have broken her rule against drinking that night, for when she arrived, she was stupid with liquor and unable to understand that the ambulance had already gone to Flushing. Flushing. You think that's
Flushing, Queens? It's like right?
Is it?
Christmas time in Hollis, Queens. Oh, it's Hollis, Queens. Flushing is Queens too.
Is it a place?
I think it's in New York, like a neighborhood.
It's not just Flushing because they're trying to get rid of the body, basically?
No, it's part of...
It's a place?
Yeah, that's what he was saying, right?
Oh, okay. Yes.
The ambulance had already gone to Flushing.
Yeah, it's capitalized. When they convinced her of this, she immediately fainted, as if that was the intolerable part of the affair. Someone kind or curious took her in his car and drove her in the wake of her sister's body. Until long after midnight, a changing crowd lapped up against the front of the garage while George Wilson rocked himself back and forth on the couch inside. For a while, the door of the office was open, and everyone who came into the garage glanced irresistibly through it. People are drawn to the morose and the tragic.
Yeah, not like the kids looking for dark spots. Like,
I know, right?
This is where the body
They're like,
was.
where was the blood?
Yeah.
Was the blood there? Finally, someone said it was a shame and closed the door. Michaelis and several other men were with him. First 4 or 5 men, later 2 or 3 men. Still later, Michaelis had to ask the last stranger to wait there 15 minutes longer while he went back to his own place and made a pot of coffee. After that, he stayed there alone with Wilson until dawn. And like Wilson has like no one in his world. The average American, according to Fitzgerald, is not just screwed by society, but also isolated and alone. About 3 o'clock, the quality of Wilson's incoherent muttering changed. He grew quieter and began to talk about the yellow car. He announced that he had a way of finding out whom the yellow car belonged to, and then he blurted out that a couple of months ago, his wife had come from the city with her face bruised and her nose swollen. But when he heard himself say this, he flinched and began to cry, "Oh, my God!" again in his groaning voice. Michaelis made a clumsy attempt to distract him. "How long have you been married, George? Come on there. Try and sit still a minute and answer my question. How long have you been married?" 12 years. Ever had any children? Come on, George. Sit still. I asked you a question. Did you ever have any children? The hard brown beetles kept thudding against the dull light, and whenever Michaelis heard a car go tearing along the road outside, it sounded to him like the car that hadn't stopped a few hours before. He didn't like to go into the garage because the workbench was stained where the body had been lying, so he moved uncomfortably around the office. He knew every object in it before morning, and from time to time sat down beside Wilson, trying to keep him more quiet. Have you got a church you go to sometimes, George? Maybe even if you haven't been there for a long time, maybe I could call up the church and get a priest to come over and he could talk to you, you see? Don't belong to any. You ought to have a church, George, for times like this. You must have gone to church once. Didn't you get married in a church? Listen, George, listen to me. Didn't you get married in a church? That was a long time ago. The effort of answering broke the rhythm of his rocking. For a moment he was silent. Then the same half-knowing, half-bewildered look came back into his faded eyes. Look in the drawer there, he said, pointing to the desk. Which drawer? That one. Michaelis opened the drawer nearest his hand. There was nothing in it but a small, expensive dog leash made of leather and braided silver. It was apparently new. This? He inquired, holding it up. Wilson stared and nodded. I found it yesterday afternoon. She tried to tell me about it, but I knew it was something funny. You mean your wife bought it? She had it wrapped in tissue paper on her bureau. Michaelis didn't see anything odd in that, and he gave Wilson a dozen reasons why his wife might have bought the dog leash. But conceivably, Wilson had heard some of these same explanations before, from Myrtle, because he began to say, "Oh my God," again in a whisper. His comforter left several explanations in the air. Then he killed her, said Wilson. His mouth dropped open suddenly. Who did? I have a way of finding out. You're morbid, George, said his friend. This has been a strain to you, and you don't know what you're saying. You'd better try and sit quiet till morning. He murdered her. It was an accident, George. Wilson shook his head. His eyes narrowed and his mouth widened slightly, with the ghost of a superior I know, he said definitely. I'm one of those trusting fellas, and I don't think any harm to nobody, but when I get to know a thing, I know it. It was the man in that car. She ran out to speak to him, and he wouldn't stop. Notice that this is like one of the few trusting people in the story, and what happens to him, he gets screwed over.
Yeah.
Michaelis had seen this too, but it hadn't occurred to him that there was any special significance to it. He believed that Mrs. Wilson had been running away from her husband rather than trying to stop any particular car. How could she have been like that? She's a deep one, said Wilson, as if that answered the question. He began to rock again, and Michaelis stood, twisting the leash in his hand. Maybe you got some friend that I could telephone for, George? This was a forlorn hope. He was almost sure that Wilson had no friend. There was not enough of him for his wife. He was glad a little later when he noticed a change in the room, a blue quickening by the window, and realized that dawn wasn't far off. About 5 o'clock, It was blue enough outside to snap off the light. Wilson's glazed eyes turned out to the ash heap, where small gray clouds took on fantastic shape and scurried here and there in the faint dawn wind. I spoke to her, he muttered after a long silence. I told her she might fool me, but she couldn't fool God. I took her to the window. With an effort, he got up and walked to the rear window and leaned with his face pressed against it. And I said, God knows what you've been doing, everything you've been doing. You may fool me, but you can't fool God. Standing behind him, Michaela saw with a shock that he was looking at the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, which had just emerged pale and enormous from the dissolving night. God sees everything, repeated Wilson. That's an advertisement, Michaelis assured him. Something made him turn away from the window and look back into the room. It's like Fitzgerald's talking about how America was largely founded, right, on religious grounds of freedom of religion, and how it's been switched out, and now people are instead of praying to God, and instead of what would be the term? You go to church and you do what? You don't
repent. You
don't celebrate God. You worship God, right? He's saying that instead of worshiping God, now people are worshiping the advertisements and the money and the goal of success. That's what they're worshiping.
Mm-hmm. I kind of look at it as like the sign represents what that, the Valley of Ashes used to be, and now it's just all forgotten and desolate. The sign is still there and it still exists, but nobody really looks at it as what it is anymore, except for this one guy. That's like the real guy in the story that really feels something, that really cares, because he's actually working to provide for his wife, whereas everyone else is like working to steal someone else's wife, or working, I don't know what, like just being rich.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's kind of like how I look at it.
That makes sense too. By 6 o'clock, Michaelis was worn out and grateful for the sound of a car stopping outside. It was one of the watchers of the night before who had promised to come back, so he cooked breakfast for 3, which he and the other man ate together. Wilson was quieter now, and Michaelis went home to sleep. When he awoke 4 hours later and hurried back to the garage, Wilson was gone. His movements, he was on foot all the time, were afterward traced to Port Roosevelt and then to Gad's Hill, where he bought a sandwich that he didn't eat and a cup of coffee. So Wilson's on foot, ironically, even though he owns a garage. He must have been tired and walking slowly, for he didn't reach Gad's Hill until noon. Thus far, there was no difficulty in accounting for his time. There were boys who had seen a man acting sort of crazy, and motorists at whom he stared oddly from the side of the road. Then for 3 hours he disappeared from view. The police, on the strength of what he said to Michaelis, that he had a way of finding out, supposed that he spent that time going from garage to garage, thereabouts inquiring for a yellow car. On the other hand, no garage man who had seen him ever came forward, and perhaps he had an easier, surer way of finding out what he wanted to know. By 2:30, he was in West Egg, where he asked someone the way to Gatsby's house. So by that time, he knew Gatsby's name. At 2 o'clock, Gatsby put on his bathing suit and left word with the butler that if anyone phoned, word was to be brought to him at the pool. He stopped at the garage for a pneumatic mattress that had amused his guests during the summer, and the chauffeur helped him pump it up. Then he gave instructions that the open car wasn't to be taken out under any circumstances, and this was strange because the front right fender needed repair. Gatsby shouldered the mattress and started for the pool. Once he stopped and shifted it a little, the chauffeur asked him if he needed help, but he shook his head and in a moment disappeared among the yellowing trees. No telephone message arrived, but the butler went without his sleep and waited for it until 4 o'clock, until long after there was anyone to give it to if it came. I have no idea that Gatsby himself didn't believe it would come, and perhaps he no longer cared. If that was true, he must have felt that he had lost the old warm world, paid a high price for living too long with a single dream. He must have looked up at an unfamiliar sky through frightening leaves, and shivered as he found what a grotesque thing a rose is, and how raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass. A new world, material without being real, where poor ghosts, breathing dreams like air, drifted fortuitously about, like that ashen, fantastic figure gliding toward him through the amorphous trees. The chauffeur, he was one of Wolfsheim's protégés, heard the shots. Afterward, he could only say that he hadn't thought anything much about them. I drove from the station directly to Gatsby's house, and my rushing anxiously up from the front steps was the first thing that alarmed anyone. But they knew then, I firmly believe. With scarcely a word said, 4 of us, the chauffeur, butler, gardener, and I, hurried down to the pool. There was a faint, barely perceptible movement of the water as the fresh flow from one end urged its way toward the drain at the other. With little ripples, there were hardly the shadows of waves. The laden mattress moved irregularly down the pool. A small gust of wind that scarcely corrugated the surface was enough to disturb its accidental course with its accidental burden. The touch of a cluster of leaves revolved it slowly, tracing, like the leg of compass, a thin red circle in the water. It was after we started with Gatsby toward the house that the gardener saw Wilson's body a little way off in the grass, and the holocaust was complete. Oh. And Wilson is dead.
Yeah.
Gatsby's
gone.
Gatsby is dead. It's like a Shakespearean tragedy.
It's so I like that Gatsby, the call that he's waiting on, right? I mean it's Daisy, right?
Right, that's what he's waiting for.
I like how it's like he knew Gatsby must have known the call wasn't coming. And if that was true, he must have felt that he had lost the old warm world. Like that's the dream. It's dead now. It's gone.
Yeah, I thought this was interesting, right? He must have looked up at an unfamiliar sky through frightening leaves and shivered as he found what a grotesque thing a rose is.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly what I was thinking of too.
Right? He's like, he thought this thing that he was obsessed with was like the ideal, and then he just realized actually it's disgusting.
Mm-hmm.
And how raw the sunlight was upon this scarcely created grass. So it's like the natural world has now disappointed him. And then what's it replaced with? New world material, right? Material is not like grass or dirt. Material is like metal, like things that are man-made, things that are unnatural. Material without being real, where poor ghosts, breathing dreams like air, drifted fortuitously about. So it's like now he's like, now I see the real world. The real world's full of ghosts, of people who are just empty.
Yeah. He has there's nothing else for him, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of, I like it too, because he's kind of like a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
My friend told me this exact story that this chick broke up with him, and he's just like floating in his parents' pool, like looking up at the sky, and then some song came on, and he just like rolled over into the pool. He's just like, and like sunk down.
The world is terrible. Yeah. It was so beautiful, and now I've learned the truth.
Yeah, it's exactly what I'm picturing.
Yeah, it's almost like
he's just a kid. He never grew up, right? He's just.
And it's almost like Fitzgerald's kind of like saying like this is something that like everyone kind of gets to at a certain point, which is that they kind of like wake up. They kind of have this this like loss of innocence. Actually, I was watching Dave Chappelle's one of his specials on Netflix where he talks about finding marijuana or finding like paper to roll marijuana joints in his son's room, and how he like cried because. Not because his son was smoking marijuana, but he cried because he had like realized finally that like his son is no longer like innocent in the world, right? And that's kind of what Fitzgerald's talking about here, where his son is not his son, Gatsby has lost his innocence, where he thinks that things are going to turn out well for him.
Hope is gone.
Yep. All right, work out.